You got a problem taking orders from white officers? Officer Ryan Keller's voice cut through the alley like the snap of a police radio, sharp enough to stop even the cold November wind drifting between the brick buildings of South Baltimore. The flashing red and blue lights from two patrol cruisers painted the wet pavement in restless colors while a crowd gathered behind the yellow tape, phones raised, faces glowing beneath the streetlights. A young black teenager stood against the hood of a patrol car with both hands visible, breathing fast, eyes darting from one officer to another like he was trying to calculate which expression might keep him safe. Officer Elijah Brooks stepped forward slowly, his boots splashing through shallow rainwater pooled beside the curb. His uniform still looked too new for the precinct, dark navy fabric crisp against his broad shoulders, silver badge reflecting the flicker of neon from the liquor store sign overhead. He wasn't tall in the intimidating way Ryan Keller was. He didn't bark orders, didn't crowd people, didn't move like a man trying to dominate a room. But there was something steady about him, something quiet that made the chaos around him feel louder. He already complied, Elijah said calmly. Ease up. Ryan turned toward him with a crooked grin that never reached his eyes. Around them, the other officers exchanged glances, already sensing entertainment. Relax, rookie, Ryan replied. This doesn't work like your little paperwork division. A few chuckles rolled through the group. Sergeant Mason Reed leaned against the cruiser, sipping burnt gas station coffee from a foam cup, watching the exchange with open amusement. The teenager swallowed hard, shoulders tense beneath the cold drizzle. Elijah looked at the kid instead of Ryan. What's your name? Darius, the teenager answered quietly. You got ID on you, Darius? Elijah asked. The boy nodded carefully toward his back pocket. Ryan scoffed loudly. Look at this. Man's giving therapy sessions now. More laughter. Someone muttered. Guess the city hired themselves another diversity transfer. Elijah ignored it. His eyes stayed on Darius. Calm. Present. Human. Go. Ahead slowly, Elijah said. Darius reached carefully into his pocket and pulled out a school ID card with trembling fingers. 17 years old. High school junior. Honor roll sticker peeling from the corner. Elijah glanced at it once before handing it back. You live around here? Darius nodded again. 3 blocks over. Ryan stepped closer, towering over both of them now. You know why we stopped you? Darius hesitated. Because somebody said there was a robbery. Exactly, Ryan said. And you happened to match the description. Elijah looked toward the dispatcher notes glowing on the cruiser laptop. Male suspect. Gray hoodie. 6 feet tall. No further description. Half the neighborhood matched that description. Ryan noticed Elijah reading the screen and smirked. Problem, Brooks. The rain intensified slightly, tapping against the cruiser roofs and sizzling against the warm hood of the patrol car. Somewhere down the block, a siren wailed and faded into the city night. Elijah closed the laptop slowly. No problem, he answered. Just making sure we're doing this right. Mason laughed under his breath. Hear that? Academy boy wants a gold star. Ryan stepped close enough now that Elijah could smell stale coffee and mint gum on his breath. Here's how this precinct works, Ryan said quietly. You back your people. You don't question them in front of civilians. Especially not on your first week. Elijah said nothing. His expression never changed. That bothered Ryan more than arguing would have. Behind them, one of the officers suddenly noticed the tiny blinking red light clipped near Elijah's shoulder. Body cam still running, he muttered. Ryan glanced at it briefly and rolled his eyes. Good, he said louder. Maybe headquarters can watch us babysit. More laughter echoed through the alley. But Elijah didn't laugh. His gaze drifted slowly across the group, memorizing faces, voices, reactions. Every joke, every smirk, every silence. Rainwater slid down the side of his face as the city lights shimmered behind him like broken glass. Then, for just a second, Elijah looked directly into the body cam lens mounted on his chest. Not angry, not afraid, just watching. Like a man quietly measuring how rotten a place really was before deciding whether it could still be saved. The rain finally eased just before midnight, leaving the streets of South Baltimore slick beneath the orange glow of aging streetlights. Elijah Brooks sat alone inside his patrol car outside Precinct 12, the windshield fogging slightly from the warmth of the heater pushing against the cold November air. The police station looked older at night, tired in a way daylight tried to hide. Cracked concrete steps, flickering bulbs above the entrance. Cigarette smoke drifting from the side alley where officers gathered during slow shifts. Elijah rested one hand against the steering wheel while the other held a thin paper folder stamped with the city seal. His transfer papers sat inside untouched. Officer transferred from Administrative Records Division. Temporary reassignment, pending evaluation. The wording was intentional. Bland. Forgettable. Exactly the way Internal Affairs preferred it. A dispatcher's voice crackled softly through the radio before fading into static again. Somewhere upstairs in the precinct, laughter erupted loud enough to echo through the old brick walls. Elijah glanced toward the second-floor windows where silhouettes moved past fluorescent light like shadows inside an aquarium. He had been inside the building less than 72 hours, and already the patterns were obvious. Which officers mocked suspects when the cameras turned away? Which ones stayed silent because silence kept pensions safe? Which ones still remembered why they wore the badge in the first place? Those were harder to find. Elijah stepped out of the cruiser slowly, the cold air brushing against his face as he adjusted his jacket collar. Across the street, a 24-hour diner glowed beneath a buzzing red sign. He crossed the empty road and pushed through the glass door, the smell of burnt coffee and bacon grease wrapping around him instantly. A tired waitress behind the counter glanced up briefly before returning to the stack of chipped mugs beside the register. Elijah slid into the last booth near the window. "Coffee?" she asked. "Black," he answered quietly. The waitress nodded once. No small talk. He appreciated that. Outside, the precinct remained in full view through the rain-speckled glass. Officers drifted in and out of the building laughing with the careless ease of men who believed the city belonged to them. Ryan Keller emerged a few minutes later with Sergeant Mason Reed beside him, both carrying takeout bags and joking loudly enough for Elijah to hear through the diner window every time the door opened. Ryan suddenly stopped mid-sentence and pointed toward the diner. "Well, look at that," he said with a grin. "Rookie works overtime." Mason glanced over and chuckled. "Man eats like he files taxes for fun." The two men entered the diner still laughing. Ryan slid into the booth directly across from Elijah without invitation, while Mason remained standing beside the table sipping from a giant fountain soda. "You always this serious?" Ryan asked. Elijah looked up calmly. "Depends on the situation." Ryan smirked. "See, that right there. That quiet act. Makes people nervous." The waitress arrived with Elijah's coffee and set it down carefully. Ryan smiled at her immediately, charm switching on like muscle memory. "Can I get fries and a burger, sweetheart?" She nodded silently and walked away. The smile vanished from Ryan's face the second she turned her back. "You know what your problem is, Brooks?" he continued, leaning back against the cracked vinyl booth. "You walk around like you are judging everybody." Elijah wrapped both hands around the warm coffee mug. "Maybe people judge themselves." Mason laughed loudly at that. "Listen to this guy." Ryan's eyes narrowed slightly. "You trying to impress someone downtown?" Elijah took a slow sip before answering. "Just trying to do the job right." A long pause settled over the booth. Outside, the wind rattled the diner windows softly while headlights reflected across the wet pavement like ribbons of silver. Ryan stared at Elijah for another second before finally smirking again. "You will learn," he said. "This city eats idealists alive." Elijah said nothing. He simply watched Ryan the same way he had watched him in the alley earlier. Calm, measuring, patient. The kind of patience that unsettled people because it felt permanent. Ryan eventually stood and tossed a crumpled $5 bill onto the table beside Elijah's untouched receipt. "Welcome to Precinct 12, he said before walking away. Mason followed him out laughing under his breath. The bell above the diner door jingled once, then silence returned. Elijah remained seated by the window long after they left. Steam curled slowly from his coffee while reflections from the precinct lights shimmered across the dark surface. Finally, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder no larger than a pack of gum. A single red light blinked steadily in the darkness. Elijah stared at it for a moment before slipping it carefully back into his pocket. Then he looked through the diner window toward the precinct again, expression unreadable, as another police cruiser rolled into the parking lot beneath the cold Baltimore rain. By 6:30 the next morning, Precinct 12 already smelled like stale coffee, wet uniforms, and overheated wiring. The building groaned awake one fluorescent light at a time, while officers drifted through the front lobby carrying paper cups and half-finished conversations. Elijah Brooks stepped through the metal detector with quiet eyes, rainwater still darkening the shoulders of his coat from the walk across the parking lot. A television mounted above the reception desk played muted local news while an exhausted desk clerk flipped through overnight reports without looking up. The station looked less like a place built for justice and more like a machine held together by routine and denial. Scuffed tile floors, faded walls, filing cabinets dented from years of slammed drawers and bad tempers. Elijah moved through the bullpen slowly, taking everything in. A whiteboard near dispatch listed arrests from the previous week. 3 names had red circles beside them. All black teenagers. No convictions yet. Near the coffee station, 2 officers laughed while watching body cam footage replay on a desktop monitor. One paused the video and zoomed in on a frightened suspect's expression like it was sports commentary instead of somebody's worst day. Look at his face. One of them laughed. Man knew he was cooked. Elijah kept walking. He noticed the rookie Hispanic officer from yesterday standing alone beside the supply closet, organizing forms with nervous hands. Officer Mateo Alvarez, 23 years old, fresh academy haircut, trying too hard not to look uncomfortable. Sergeant Mason Reed walked past him carrying a stack of paperwork and deliberately bumped the folders from Mateo's hands onto the floor. Papers scattered across the bullpen like fallen leaves. Several officers snickered without even glancing up from their desks. Move faster, Mason muttered. This is not daycare. Mateo crouched quickly to gather the papers, cheeks burning red beneath the station lights. Elijah stopped beside him and silently picked up the last few pages. Mateo looked up with surprise. Thanks, he said quietly. Elijah handed him the stack. You doing okay? Mateo forced a smile that fooled nobody. Yeah, just trying not to screw up. Elijah studied him for a second before nodding once. That place can smell fear, he said softly. Do not feed it. Mateo blinked slightly, unsure whether to laugh or take the advice seriously. Before he could answer, Ryan Keller entered the bullpen carrying a fresh coffee and the energy of somebody who enjoyed having an audience. The room shifted almost automatically when he walked in. Conversations paused. Heads turned. Ryan thrived on attention the same way some men thrived on sunlight. Morning, gentlemen, he announced loudly before spotting Elijah near the supply closet. And there he is, Baltimore's quiet philosopher. A few officers chuckled immediately. Ryan walked over slowly, sipping his coffee while eyeing the papers still in Mateo's arms. You babysitting rookies now too? Elijah leaned casually against the metal cabinet beside him, helping a coworker. Ryan smirked. See, that right there is your problem. You think this place runs on feelings. He gestured toward the bullpen around them. This city is a war zone. You survive by staying hard. Elijah glanced toward the holding cells down the hallway where a homeless man sat wrapped in a thin gray blanket, staring blankly at the floor. Maybe that is why nobody trusts us anymore, Elijah answered quietly. The bullpen fell noticeably quieter. Ryan's smile tightened slightly. Around them, officers pretended to work while listening carefully. Mason Reed stepped closer, sensing tension the way sharks sensed blood in water. You saying we are the problem? Mason asked. Elijah met his eyes calmly. I am saying people remember how you treat them. Ryan laughed once under his breath. Man, you really do sound like internal affairs. The room erupted with scattered laughter again. Elijah said nothing. He simply reached for a clipboard resting on the counter and signed out his patrol assignment for the day. Ryan watched him carefully now, curiosity mixing with irritation. Most officers either tried to impress him or avoided him completely. Elijah did neither. That unsettled him. A dispatcher suddenly called from across the bullpen. Domestic disturbance on Fremont Avenue. Unit needed. Ryan grabbed his keys instantly. Brooks, you are with me. Mason smirked into his coffee cup. Good luck, rookie. Elijah slipped on his gloves slowly before following Ryan toward the garage. As the heavy station doors opened, cold morning air rushed inside, carrying the smell of rain and engine exhaust. Outside, rows of patrol cars sat beneath the gray Baltimore sky with water still dripping from their windshields. Ryan unlocked the cruiser and tossed Elijah the passenger side radio without looking at him. One rule, Ryan said as the engine started with a low growl. Do not embarrass me out there. Elijah clicked the seatbelt into place and stared through the windshield at the waking city ahead of them. That depends, he answered calmly. On what? Ryan asked. Elijah turned slightly toward him, expression unreadable beneath the cold blue dashboard glow. On what you plan to do. The patrol cruiser rolled through Fremont Avenue beneath a gray morning sky that hung low over the city like damp concrete. Storefront shutters rattled in the wind while old row houses stood shoulder to shoulder with peeling paint and rusted railings. Elijah Brooks sat quietly in the passenger seat watching pedestrians move along, the sidewalks with their heads lowered against the cold. A woman pulled two children closer as the cruiser passed. An elderly man waiting at a bus stop looked away entirely. Ryan Keller noticed it too. See that? He said while steering one-handed. People fear us because they know we keep order. Elijah kept his eyes on the street ahead. Fear and respect are not the same thing. Ryan smirked without looking at him. You really love those little speeches. The radio crackled suddenly. Unit 12 respond. Caller reports disturbance inside apartment building. Possible child involved. Ryan grabbed the mic immediately. Unit 12 en route. The cruiser accelerated through a yellow light, tires hissing against wet pavement. 10 minutes later, they pulled beside a faded brick apartment complex with boarded basement windows and overflowing trash bins lining the alley. A young black woman stood outside the entrance, clutching a sweater tightly around herself despite the cold. Her breathing looked uneven. Frightened, exhausted, Elijah stepped out first while Ryan slammed the cruiser door behind him. You called? Elijah asked calmly. The woman nodded quickly. It is my sister upstairs. Her boyfriend came back drunk again. My nephew is inside. Ryan immediately started toward the building entrance. Which apartment? Third floor. Apartment 312. The woman hesitated before adding quietly. Please do not make things worse. Ryan glanced back over his shoulder with visible annoyance. Lady, we are trying to help. Elijah noticed the way she flinched anyway. Inside, the building smelled like mildew, cigarette smoke, and old radiator heat. The stairwell lights flickered overhead while muffled shouting echoed faintly from somewhere above them. Ryan moved fast up the stairs with one hand resting near his belt while Elijah followed at a measured pace behind him. On the third floor, the hallway narrowed into peeling yellow walls and stained carpet. Apartment 312 stood half open. A little boy no older than 8 sat outside the door hugging his knees beneath an oversized Ravens hoodie. His eyes widened when he saw the uniforms. Elijah crouched slightly too. Meet him at eye level. Hey buddy, he said softly. You okay? The boy nodded too quickly. The kind of nod children used when they had learned honesty sometimes caused trouble. Ryan pushed through the apartment doorway without knocking. Police department, he barked loudly. Inside, dishes cluttered the sink and a television blared cartoons no one was watching. A tired-looking black woman stood near the kitchen counter wiping tears from her cheeks, while a heavy-set man paced near the living room window muttering angrily under his breath. Ryan immediately took control of the room with sharp commands and a hard voice that filled every corner of the apartment. Elijah stayed near the doorway instead, noticing details Ryan ignored. The empty refrigerator except for milk and sandwich bread. The eviction notice folded beneath unpaid utility bills. The little boy's school backpack resting beside the couch with math homework sticking halfway out. Fear lived here long before the police arrived. You threatening her? Ryan demanded toward the man. I did not touch anybody, the man answered defensively. We were arguing. The woman looked down at the floor without speaking. Elijah stepped toward her carefully. Ma'am, he said gently. Do you feel safe right now? She hesitated. Ryan scoffed quietly from across the room, like the question itself annoyed him. The woman glanced nervously between both officers before whispering. He just needs somewhere to go tonight. Ryan threw his hands up immediately. Unbelievable. He turned toward the man. Grab your coat. The man stiffened. For what? Because I said so. Elijah watched the tension rising inside the room like steam building under pressure. The little boy still sat outside the apartment listening through the cracked doorway with frightened eyes. Elijah stepped closer to Ryan and lowered his voice. There is another way to handle this. Ryan stared at him in disbelief. You serious right now? There is a shelter on Green Street with emergency beds, Elijah said calmly. No charges. No scene in front of the kid. Ryan laughed under his breath. You think social work fixes this city? Elijah looked toward the boy. Outside the door. Maybe not. But humiliation never does. Silence settled over the apartment for one long second. Even the television noise suddenly felt distant. The woman looked at Elijah with cautious surprise, like kindness from a uniform confused her more than anger ever could. Ryan noticed it too. That bothered him. A lot. He stepped close enough now that Elijah could smell coffee and frustration on his breath. "You keep undermining me in front of civilians," Ryan said quietly. "And this precinct is going to eat you alive." Elijah did not move. Did not blink. Then maybe the precinct should learn the difference between authority and control. Ryan stared at him coldly while rain tapped softly against the apartment window behind them, and somewhere down the hallway the little boy finally loosened his grip around his knees. By late afternoon the rain had stopped, but the city still looked soaked in gray. Water dripped from traffic lights and gathered along cracked curbs, while Precinct 12 buzzed with the restless energy of officers changing shifts. Elijah Brooks walked through the bullpen carrying a thin stack of reports under one arm when the room suddenly went quiet enough for him to notice. Not silent. Worse, controlled silence. The kind people created when they wanted someone to know they were being watched. Ryan Keller leaned against the front desk with Sergeant Mason Reed beside him, both staring openly now as Elijah crossed the room. "There he is," Ryan said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Baltimore's favorite social worker. A few officers laughed into their coffee cups. Elijah kept walking toward his desk without reacting. Ryan pushed off the counter and followed him slowly like a man enjoying a performance. "Heard you almost let that guy walk this morning," Ryan continued. "Domestic call, possible threat, and Officer Brooks here wants group therapy instead of policing." More scattered laughter rippled through the bullpen. Elijah placed the reports carefully on his desk before removing his gloves one finger at a time. Calm. Measured. Ryan hated that calmness more every hour. "Nobody got arrested," Elijah answered quietly. "Nobody got hurt either." Ryan spread his arms dramatically toward the room. "Hear that? Man solve crime with feelings." Mason Reed snorted loudly. "Maybe next week he will hand out blankets and hot chocolate." Even officers pretending not to listen smirked behind computer screens. Elijah noticed Mateo Alvarez near dispatch lowering his eyes awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable but too afraid to speak. Across the room, an older black desk clerk named Lorraine quietly stopped typing altogether. She had worked at the precinct for nearly 20 years and wore the exhausted expression of somebody who had watched too many good officers either leave or change. Ryan stepped closer until he stood directly beside Elijah's desk. "You know what your issue really is?" he asked. "You came in here thinking this badge makes everybody equal." Elijah finally looked up at him. "Does it not?" Ryan smiled slowly. "Not in the real world." The bullpen grew still again. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, while somewhere down the hallway a printer spit out paperwork with mechanical rhythm. Elijah held Ryan's stare without blinking. That sounds like a dangerous mindset for a police officer. A few heads lifted immediately at that. Ryan's smile vanished. Mason straightened beside him, sensing the mood shift. "Careful," Ryan said quietly now. "You are still new here." Elijah leaned back slightly in his chair. "And you are still wearing a body camera." The words landed harder than shouting would have. Several officers exchanged quick glances. Ryan's jaw tightened for just a second before he forced another grin onto his face. "You think you are smarter than everybody in this room?" Elijah answered calmly. "No. I think accountability scares people who have never faced it." The bullpen erupted into uncomfortable noise immediately afterward. Chairs moved. Drawers slammed. Someone cursed under their breath. Nobody wanted that conversation hanging in open air too long. Ryan stared at Elijah with cold disbelief now, like he was trying to decide whether the man across from him was brave or stupid. Then the station alarm suddenly buzzed overhead. Dispatch called out from across the room. Possible armed robbery. Suspect heading east on Monroe. Units responding now. Ryan grabbed his radio instantly, grateful for interruption. Keller responding. Mason moved beside him while several officers rushed toward the garage doors. Ryan pointed directly at Elijah. "You are with me." Minutes later, the cruiser sped through evening traffic beneath streaks of fading orange sunlight. Sirens echoed between apartment buildings while pedestrians stepped quickly off crosswalks. Ryan drove aggressively, one hand gripping the wheel while the radio crackled nonstop beside him. Suspect wearing dark hoodie, dispatch reported. Last seen near Lexington Market. Elijah watched the streets carefully as they approached the crowded blocks downtown. People moved everywhere. Vendors closing carts. Mothers carrying grocery bags. Teenagers laughing outside corner stores. Then Ryan suddenly pointed through the windshield. There! A young black man in a dark sweatshirt hurried across the sidewalk, carrying a backpack. Ryan slammed the brakes hard beside the curb and jumped out immediately. Police. Stop. The young man froze instantly, eyes wide with panic. Elijah stepped out slower, scanning the scene carefully. Something felt wrong. The kid looked terrified, not dangerous. Around them, pedestrians slowed to watch. Phones already rising. Ryan moved toward the teenager fast while barking sharp commands that echoed against the storefront windows. Elijah noticed the backpack hanging halfway open. Inside sat textbooks. A rolled-up art portfolio. Nothing else. Ryan, Elijah said quietly. Hold on. Ryan ignored him completely. The teenager's breathing became visibly uneven beneath the flashing patrol lights. Elijah stepped between them slightly, lowering his own voice toward the kid. What is your name? Andre, the teenager whispered. I am late for class. Elijah glanced toward the nearby bus stop shelter where a large advertisement displayed the logo of Baltimore Community College. Evening art courses. Ryan finally looked at the open backpack too. The tension in his face shifted immediately into irritation. Not relief. Irritation. Because being wrong in public embarrassed him. Around them, people were still watching. Recording. Elijah saw it happen in Ryan's eyes before he even spoke. Pride choosing anger over humility. Next time, Ryan snapped toward the teenager. Do not run when police are around. Andre nodded quickly and hurried away into the crowd. Silence lingered beside the cruiser afterward except for distant traffic and the soft crackle of the police radio. Ryan climbed back into the driver's seat hard enough to rattle the dashboard. He stared straight ahead while gripping the steering wheel with both hands. Then finally, without looking at Elijah, he spoke through clenched teeth. You are becoming a real problem for me. Night settled over Baltimore like a heavy coat soaked in cold rainwater. By 11:40, Precinct 12 had finally gone quiet enough for the building itself to be heard. Old pipes rattled behind the walls. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with uneven rhythm. Somewhere deep inside the station, an exhausted printer clicked through paperwork no one wanted to finish before morning. Elijah Brooks sat alone in the evidence review room at the far end of the second floor, surrounded by dim monitor glow and stacks of sealed case folders. The small room smelled faintly of dust, burnt coffee, and overheated electronics. Most officers avoided the space because it felt too silent, too far from the noise and ego of the bullpen downstairs. Elijah preferred it for exactly that reason. A desk lamp cast soft amber light across the surface of the table, while rain tapped lightly against the narrow window beside him. On the monitor in front of him, bodycam footage rolled frame by frame in complete silence. Officer interactions, traffic stops, street encounters, tiny moments most people forgot seconds after they happened. Elijah watched everything carefully, not just actions, expressions, tone, timing. Who escalated situations? Who calmed them? Who performed for other officers once civilians became audiences? Ryan Keller appeared often. Too often. Elijah paused the footage on one frame where Ryan stood over a terrified teenager beneath flashing patrol lights. Even frozen, the image carried tension. Power leaning too hard against fear. Elijah removed his glasses slowly and rubbed tired eyes. He had not slept more than 4 hours a night since arriving in Baltimore. The city felt heavy in a way statistics never captured inside reports. Fear lived everywhere here. On sidewalks. In schools. In the eyes of mothers pulling children closer whenever patrol cars rolled by. He understood that fear because he had grown up inside it. His father used to stand by the apartment window every night waiting for Elijah's older brother to come home safely from work. Not because the neighborhood was dangerous. Because police stops were unpredictable. One misunderstanding. One wrong tone. One frightened officer with pride bigger than patience. That was all it took to change a family forever. Elijah opened the top drawer of the desk and quietly removed an old silver badge wrapped inside a handkerchief. His father's badge. Chicago Transit Police. The metal had faded over the years, but the edges still caught the light. Elijah turned it carefully between his fingers while rainwater streaked down the dark window beside him. "You cannot force respect out of people," his father used to say. "You earn it by making them feel safe." Downstairs, sudden laughter echoed faintly through the stairwell before fading again. Ryan's voice, loud, confident, untouchable. Elijah set the old badge beside the keyboard and returned his attention to the monitor. Another bodycam clip loaded automatically. Date stamp from 6 months earlier. Nighttime traffic stop. Ryan Keller and 2 officers surrounding a frightened driver while joking casually among themselves. Elijah watched the driver's hands trembling against the steering wheel under flashing blue lights. Then he noticed something else. Sergeant Mason Reed, standing near the back of the scene, deliberately turning his own body cam away from the interaction. Elijah leaned closer toward the screen. There. Small. Intentional. A habit repeated more than once throughout the footage archive. His expression hardened slightly for the first time all night. The precinct did not just have attitude problems. It had a system, patterns, protection, silence disguised as loyalty. Elijah reached for the digital recorder in his jacket pocket and placed it gently on the desk beside the old badge. The tiny red light blinked steadily inside the dark room. He pressed play. Ryan's voice filled the silence immediately from earlier that afternoon. "This city eats idealists alive." Elijah listened without expression while rain continued tapping softly against the glass. Another recording followed. Mason laughing. Officers mocking suspects. Quiet racist jokes buried beneath humor, just believable enough to deny later. Every sound carried the same poison underneath it. Dehumanize people long enough, and eventually cruelty starts feeling normal. Elijah leaned back slowly in the chair while the monitor glow reflected across his tired face. Outside the evidence room window, the city stretched endlessly beneath the storm clouds. Ambulance lights flickered somewhere downtown like distant fireflies trapped inside the rain. He thought about Darius in the alley. The little boy outside apartment 312. Mateo Alvarez pretending not to hear insults because survival mattered more than dignity on his first month in uniform. Good people shrinking themselves to fit broken systems. Elijah closed his eyes briefly before slipping his father's badge back into the handkerchief. Then he reached into his inside jacket pocket and removed a folded letter stamped with the seal of the Internal Affairs Bureau. Transfer authorization. Command reassignment approval pending final review. Captain Elijah Brooks. He stared at the words for several long seconds before folding the document carefully again. Downstairs, another burst of laughter rose through the station halls while thunder rolled faintly somewhere beyond the city skyline. Elijah looked back toward the glowing monitor where Ryan Keller's frozen image still waited beneath flashing patrol lights. Calmly, almost sadly, Elijah whispered into the empty room, "You still think nobody is watching?" Monday morning arrived cold and sharp beneath a pale gray sky that made downtown Baltimore look carved from steel. By 7:45, every officer inside Precinct 12 had been ordered into the main briefing room. The atmosphere felt strange from the moment people walked in. Too organized. Too quiet. Even the usual joking near the coffee station sounded forced now. Officers filled rows of metal chairs beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, while the giant projector screen at the front of the room glowed blue and empty. Ryan Keller leaned against the back wall with his arms folded, trading quiet comments with Mason Reed while pretending not to notice the unusual number of city officials entering the station. 2 men in dark suits stood near the doorway speaking softly with the deputy chief. Mateo Alvarez sat near the middle row nervously tapping a pen against his notebook. Lorraine from the front desk lingered near the side entrance holding paperwork she clearly forgot to deliver because her attention stayed fixed on the room itself. Something was happening. Everyone felt it. The clock above the whiteboard clicked to 7:52. Then the briefing room doors opened again. Elijah Brooks entered carrying nothing except a slim black folder tucked beneath one arm. Conversations immediately softened into murmurs. Ryan smirked the second he saw him. "Look alive," he muttered toward Mason. Paperwork division made it. A few nearby officers chuckled automatically. Elijah ignored them and quietly took a seat near the front row. Calm as always. That calmness irritated Ryan now more than ever because it no longer felt passive. It felt intentional, deliberate, like a man waiting for a train he already knew was coming. The deputy chief stepped toward the podium exactly at 8 o'clock sharp. His expression carried none of the lazy exhaustion officers were used to seeing every morning. Today he looked formal, controlled. Behind him, the large projector screen flickered once before displaying the seal of the Internal Affairs Bureau across bright blue light. The room shifted instantly. Nobody laughed now. Ryan's smirk faded slightly. "Good morning," the deputy chief began. "As many of you know, the city authorized a full internal review of operational conduct within Precinct 12 approximately 6 months ago." Chairs creaked softly. Mason Reed straightened beside the wall. Ryan's folded arms tightened across his chest. The deputy chief continued. "The investigation focused on patterns of misconduct, improper reporting procedures, discriminatory policing behavior, and violations of departmental accountability standards." The room felt colder somehow. Elijah sat perfectly still near the front row while rain clouds drifted slowly beyond the narrow station windows. Then the projector screen suddenly changed. Bodycam footage appeared across the wall in sharp high definition. Ryan Keller's face filled the screen immediately, laughing during a traffic stop, mocking civilians, escalating encounters unnecessarily. More clips followed one after another. Mason Reed turning cameras away during incidents. Officers joking openly about suspects after arrests. Silence spread through the briefing room like floodwater. Nobody moved. Nobody coughed. The only sound came from the projector fan humming softly above them. Ryan stared at the screen in complete disbelief. "What is this?" he snapped suddenly. The deputy chief did not answer him. Another clip began playing. Fremont Avenue. The domestic disturbance call. Ryan barking commands while Elijah's voice stayed calm in the background. The little boy outside apartment 312 appeared briefly near the hallway wall, hugging his knees. Then came Lexington Market. Andre holding his art portfolio while Ryan confronted him beneath flashing lights. The footage paused there. Frozen. The room remained absolutely still. Ryan slowly turned toward Elijah now, confusion spreading across his face piece by piece like cracking glass. Elijah finally stood up from his chair. No anger, no smugness, just quiet gravity settling across the room the second he moved. He walked calmly toward the front podium, while every pair of eyes followed him in stunned silence. The deputy chief stepped aside without a word. Elijah placed the slim black folder onto the podium and opened it carefully. Inside sat official documents stamped with city seals and internal affairs authorization signatures. Then he looked directly at Ryan Keller for the first time all morning. "My name," Elijah said calmly, his deep voice filling the silent room without effort, "is Captain Elijah Brooks." Nobody breathed. Ryan's face drained of color instantly. Mason Reed stared forward like his brain had stopped processing language altogether. Even the officers who disliked Elijah looked shaken now because suddenly every conversation, every joke, every insult replayed itself differently inside their heads. Elijah continued speaking with the same steady calmness that had unsettled them since the first day. "For the last several weeks, I have been conducting an undercover leadership assessment and misconduct investigation authorized jointly by Internal Affairs and the Baltimore Police Accountability Commission." The words landed heavier than shouting ever could. Ryan blinked slowly as realization finally hit him completely. Every hallway comment, every body cam recording, every attempt to humiliate the quiet black rookie officer. Documented, preserved, watched. Elijah rested one hand lightly against the podium. "This investigation was never about destroying officers," he said quietly. "It was about determining whether this precinct still remembers who the badge is supposed to protect." No one spoke. Outside the station windows, rain finally began falling again across the city, while inside Precinct 12 the silence felt so complete it almost sounded sacred. The silence inside Precinct 12 did not break all at once. It cracked slowly, like ice under too much weight. Officers shifted uneasily in their chairs while rain streaked down the briefing room windows in crooked silver lines. Nobody looked at Ryan Keller anymore. A few minutes earlier he had owned the room without trying. Now he stood near the back wall with both hands hanging stiffly at his sides, staring at Captain Elijah Brooks like he no longer recognized the world around him. The projector screen still glowed behind the podium, frozen on the image of Lexington Market where Andre stood clutching his art portfolio beneath flashing police lights. Elijah closed the black folder calmly, and rested both hands against the podium. Effective immediately, the deputy chief announced quietly, "All officers named in the preliminary misconduct review will surrender active patrol duties pending further investigation." The words dropped heavily into the room. Mason Reed looked down at the floor. One of the younger officers removed his badge clip with visibly shaking fingers. Ryan finally stepped forward. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You send somebody undercover into a precinct and call it leadership?" His voice sounded louder now because nobody else was speaking. Elijah met his stare calmly. "No, Officer Keller," he answered. "What happened here was exposure." Ryan laughed once under his breath, but there was no confidence left inside it. "You think you know this city after a few weeks?" Elijah's expression never changed. "I know enough to recognize when fear becomes culture." Rain hammered harder against the windows now, soft but relentless. Somewhere down the hallway a phone rang unanswered before stopping abruptly. The station itself felt different already, like truth had entered the building and pushed all the oxygen out. Ryan took another step forward. "You walked in here pretending to be one of us." "I was one of you," Elijah replied quietly. That was the point. The room fell still again. Mateo Alvarez sat frozen near the middle row, eyes fixed on Elijah with something close to disbelief. Lorraine near the side door quietly wiped at one eye before pretending to reorganize her paperwork. She had worked in that station long enough to know how rare this moment really was. Ryan looked around the room desperately now, searching for support that no longer existed. Nobody met his eyes. Not Mason. Not the officers who used to laugh beside him near the coffee station every morning. Shame had entered the room, and suddenly everybody became very interested in the floor. "So what now?" Ryan asked bitterly. "You parade us through the news? Destroy careers?" Elijah stepped down from the podium slowly. His shoes echoed softly across the tile floor as he approached Ryan without aggression, without triumph. That made the moment heavier somehow. "If I wanted humiliation," Elijah said quietly, "I would have exposed this months ago." Ryan's jaw tightened. Elijah stopped a few feet away from him beneath the cold fluorescent lights. "Do you know what the worst part of this investigation was?" he asked. Ryan said nothing. Elijah glanced briefly around the room before answering his own question. "Most of the officers here are not evil men." Several people shifted uncomfortably at that. They just got used to small acts of disrespect. Little jokes, little shortcuts, little moments where dignity stopped mattering. Ryan's face hardened defensively. "That is not on me alone." "No," Elijah agreed softly. "It is on everyone who watched and decided silence was easier." The words hit harder than accusation. Even Mason Reed lowered his head after hearing them. For a long moment nobody spoke. Then Ryan finally exhaled slowly and rubbed one hand across his face like exhaustion had suddenly caught up to him all at once. When he looked back up again, the anger in his expression had weakened into something quieter. "Older. I thought staying hard kept people alive," he admitted quietly. Elijah nodded once. "A lot of officers tell themselves that." "And you?" Ryan asked. "What keeps people alive?" Elijah looked toward the rain-covered station windows where blurred patrol lights reflected against the glass like fading fire. "Knowing the badge belongs to the public," he answered, "not the officer wearing it." The room remained silent after that because there was nothing clever left to say. No jokes, no sarcasm, just the uncomfortable weight of truth settling into old walls. A city official near the doorway finally stepped forward with suspension paperwork, while another officer quietly collected duty weapons from the names listed under review. Ryan stared at the forms for several long seconds before accepting them with numb hands. Then something unexpected happened. One of the younger officers near the back of the room stood up slowly and looked toward Elijah. "Captain," he said carefully, voice uneven, "can this place actually change?" Every eye turned toward Elijah again. He paused before answering. "Only if people care more about integrity than ego." The young officer nodded silently and sat back down. Ryan remained standing near the wall holding the suspension papers loosely at his side, while rainwater continued sliding down the station. Windows behind him. For the first time since Elijah arrived at Precinct 12, Ryan Keller looked small. Not because somebody destroyed him, because somebody finally forced him to see himself clearly. 3 weeks later, the rain finally stopped over Baltimore. The city woke beneath clear morning light for the first time in days, sunlight spilling across wet sidewalks and glass towers like something cautiously returning after a long absence. Precinct 12 looked different now. Not transformed overnight. Not magically healed. Just quieter. More careful. The old jokes near the coffee station had disappeared. Officers knocked before entering interview rooms. Body cameras stayed on longer. Small changes. Human changes. The kind that mattered because they happened when nobody was trying to impress anyone. Captain Elijah Brooks stepped through the station entrance at 6:50 in the morning carrying a paper cup of black coffee and a slim leather folder tucked beneath one arm. The lobby smelled faintly of fresh paint where maintenance crews had patched old cracks along the walls over the weekend. Someone had replaced the flickering front desk light that had buzzed for years. Lorraine stood behind reception wearing reading glasses low on her nose while sorting overnight reports. She looked up as Elijah entered. "Morning, Captain," she said softly. Elijah nodded once. "Morning, Lorraine." There was warmth in the exchange now. Respect without performance. He moved through the bullpen slowly while early sunlight stretched across the tile floor in long golden shapes. Officers looked up from desks as he passed. Some nodded immediately. Others still seemed uncertain around him, unsure how to act now that the old culture had cracked open in front of everybody. Elijah did not demand anything from them. That was what unsettled some people most. Near dispatch, Mateo Alvarez stood helping another rookie organize evidence forms. His posture looked different now. Straighter somehow, less afraid to exist inside the uniform. When he noticed Elijah approaching, he gave a quick nod. "Captain." Elijah glanced toward the reports in his hands. "You handling the Jefferson case?" Mateo nodded. "Trying to." Elijah picked up one of the folders briefly. "Do not rush the witness statements. Let people finish speaking before you decide what matters." Mateo smiled faintly. "Yes, sir." As Elijah continued walking, he noticed something taped quietly beside the briefing room doorway. A handwritten sign. Integrity first. No official order had placed it there. No memo. Somebody inside the precinct had written it voluntarily. Elijah paused for half a second studying the uneven black marker letters before continuing down the hallway. Through the front station windows, the city looked alive again. School buses groaned past intersections. Street vendors opened carts beneath rising steam from subway grates. A black father walked his little daughter across the crosswalk outside the station while holding her hand tightly against the morning traffic. The little girl glanced curiously toward the patrol cars parked outside. Then she waved shyly toward the building. Elijah lifted one hand back and returned through the glass before she disappeared around the corner, smiling. Small things. Those were the moments people forgot mattered until they vanished. Inside his office, sunlight spilled across the wooden desk where his father's old silver badge rested beside a stack of precinct reform proposals waiting for review. Elijah removed his jacket slowly and hung it near the door before standing quietly beside the window overlooking downtown Baltimore. The city hummed below him with all its noise and exhaustion and stubborn hope. Then a soft knock came at the office door. Elijah turned. Ryan Keller stood outside wearing plain clothes instead of a uniform. He looked older now. Not physically, spiritually, like somebody who had spent several nights unable to outrun his own thoughts. Elijah studied him for a moment before speaking. "Come in." Ryan stepped inside carefully, hands clasped awkwardly in front of him. The silence between them felt different now too. Not hostile, honest. Ryan glanced briefly at the captain bars resting on Elijah's desk before lowering his eyes again. "I heard they are offering retraining instead of termination," he said quietly. Elijah nodded once. "For some officers." Ryan swallowed slowly. "I do not know if I deserve it." Elijah looked out the window again toward the city streets below. "That depends on what you do next." Ryan stood there for another second before nodding faintly. No excuses this time. No sarcasm. Just acceptance. "I was wrong about you," he admitted quietly. Elijah's expression softened almost invisibly. "No," he answered. "You were wrong about what leadership looks like." Ryan lowered his head briefly before turning toward the office door. As he left, morning sunlight followed him down the hallway in long pale streaks across the station floor. Elijah remained beside the window alone after that, listening to the distant sounds of keyboards clicking, phones ringing, officers beginning another shift. Ordinary sounds. Necessary sounds. He reached into his desk drawer and carefully picked up his father's old badge once more, turning the faded silver between his fingers while sunlight reflected softly across the worn metal. Outside, another patrol car pulled away from the curb beneath the bright Baltimore sky. This time, when pedestrians looked toward it, fewer faces turned away in fear. Elijah watched the cruiser disappear into traffic before quietly placing the old badge back onto the desk beside the words "integrity first." Then he stood there in the stillness of the office while morning light filled the room and the city breathed steadily.